Hello, everyone. This is W, host of the High Art on the Edge page, host of Surprisecast. And today I have a very special event lined up for you. Why? Because I'm not going to be talking and interviewing an artist musician per se. I'm going to be speaking with a gentleman that has great knowledge when it comes to music, has a great love and appreciation and respect for the history of music, and someone that I have found to be very passionate and is here today to join us to talk about a band we both greatly respect and admire, and that would be Orchestral Manoeuvers in the Dark. Chris Gilliland is here to join us in the Surprisecast studio. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Can you tell the listeners
How are you?
where I'm doing well, thank you. Tell the listeners where you're podcasting from.
I'm in Portland, Oregon today. That's where I live, so I shouldn't say today. I'm always in Portland.
Wonderful. And Chris, just to give the listeners a little bit of background, actually, I'm going to allow you to go first. We're here today to honor a great band out of Liverpool, England, a band that has been doing and creating music for over 40 years, a band that is so instrumental and impactful in the music industry. Could you tell the listeners how OMD entered into your life?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that grew up, came of age in the 80s like I did, a lot of people were introduced to them through the Pretty in Pink soundtrack. So I discovered them through the If You Leave, of course, and being someone that likes to delve into the background of artists that I'm introduced to, I loved that song, and I immediately searched for more of their music and bought the current album at the time, which I believe was Crush. And then when the earlier albums were re-released on CD, I bought those, stacked those all up at the same time, and discovered that I really, 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 really liked the early stuff, and became a pretty big fan at that point.
Thank you for sharing and retracing your steps a little bit. And we will definitely take a deeper dive into their earlier material. For me, it really was about that Crush album. And I remember at that time in my life, oh goodness, 5th or 6th grade, I was in the Bay Area. And we used to have these dances here in Menlo Park, just outside Palo Alto. And at these dances, all the boys would be on one side and all the girls would be on the other. And I remember hearing So in Love for the first time. And I was hooked. Absolutely. I was mesmerized by this beat, this synth pop feel, this flavor, and the melodic sounds, along with Andy's vocals. And I took a deeper dive into that. And I remember my friend and he had the tape, and we listened to the tape nonstop. And it really became a staple and part of my growing up experience with that album, So in Love, Secrets, you name it. And that also opened the doors for bands like Pet Shop Boys, Erasure, really opened that avenue for me to explore in terms of the synth pop world, the new wave, if you will. And then I've been following them ever since. And it's been an incredible ride to be a part of as a fan, because as we know, this band was not destined to be anything. They just were creating music, and that's really it. They didn't have many plans. to go deep, far, and wide. Well, they proved themselves wrong, and we'll talk all about that stuff later. So that was kind of my entry point into their world. Now, with regards to this conversation, we're going to focus on 3 albums. The first is their self-titled. Second one will be Organization. And the third one will be Architecture and Morality. So with regards to the first album, which we're going to explore right now, could you tell the listeners, what is it about this album that you appreciate, Chris?
It's difficult to put into words. I have a really strong attraction to that early 80s simple synth sounds combined with the live bass guitar. And I don't know, there's just something very human and warm about it to me. And to be honest, when I first heard it kind of reminded me of Gary Newman, who I was a big fan of as a small kid. And I just really am drawn to that sound. I don't know what it is in it. Even today, if there's a new artist that if they have that live bass electric guitar combined with the synth, I'm just immediately drawn to it.
I would agree with you in that statement. And I would also add, with regards to this album, this debut album, to me, there is something within those notes. There is something very mysterious. There's something haunting going on. Yet, juxtaposed with, there's something romantic. There's something that imbues those qualities of kind of making the heart swell. And they're so good at that. And as time moves forward, they become masters of it in creating those hooks. And I think it starts with Peter Saville in the album cover for me. There's some enigmatic stuff going on, very artsy stuff. And we all know Andy McCluskey and Paul Humphreys are great appreciators of art. So if you take the album cover and then you take these songs, which we know were, they self-produced this album. It's amazing that this is their debut album. And I always go back like, wow. Does it sound a little dated? Sure. But in a great way. And if I had made this record, I would have been extremely proud of this debut album. And I'm going to ask you a question here in a second, but I want to read you a quote that I dug up. This is from Andy McCluskey, and he says, "We ended up using our self-produced version of Electricity for the factory single because Martin's version, Martin Hannett, was too lush. And he also washed it, B-side, almost in reverb, making it far more ambient than we envisioned. With hindsight, what he did to Almost was beautiful, and I did eventually come to love it. But ultimately, Martin wanted to impose his vision of our music on us, whether we liked it or not. And we already had a clear idea of how we wanted Orchestral Manoeuvers in the Dark to sound." That's pretty incredible. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. That's really incredible. I like that they had such a vision of what they're doing. From what I've learned about the technology that they were kind of just piecing it together fascinates me. I don't know. The vision is it's pretty amazing, especially considering that it didn't seem like that they were in it for the long term, even though they have been, to have that sort of willingness to be forceful with their vision is really impressive.
I completely concur. And this may be easy for you. It may be difficult. Could you tell us a couple songs that you greatly enjoy from this album?
Yeah, of course. I love the opening Bunker Soldiers. Of course, Electricity is endlessly exciting to me. I remember hearing it at 7, 8 years ago when Lush toured. They played it in the at the local venue. They played it leading up to before Lush took the stage, and it
Wow.
sounded so amazing, loud in a venue like that, and I just fell in love with it all over again. It was like the first time I'd ever heard it, just spine tingling. So I will always love that song. And then you mentioned Almost. That song is one of my favorites of all of their albums. I just love the mysterious vibe to it. And I especially love the vocals on that one.
Yeah. And I know as we get deeper into their work, the vocal interplay, the vocal melodies, the vocal arrangements, I have a feeling this is going to come up as a repeated motif in terms of our analysis. I forgot to mention another thing that I greatly admire about this album and subsequent albums. It was one of the few bands that I feel like I was getting an education in terms of historical references. And there may have been other bands when I was younger. I just wasn't paying attention as much as to what I was doing with OMD. The Messerschmitt Twins is one of my favorites on the album. And I've always thought, like, what would that song sound like in a live setting? And what would be the visuals for that? And then you mentioned Almost, I echo those sentiments in terms of the vocal work. And you take two of those songs and then you still have the others. And again, I feel as though these songs could also, they stand out on their own. They're so different from one another. And that's pretty impressive, in my opinion. And could this album be made today? Sure. But I would be hard pressed to say, you know what? It could be made, but I don't think many people would venture to do it. And had I been around a music lover in 1979, 1980, when this album was released, there is no way I could have sat there and go, oh, this band's going to be doing this for 40 years. And I like the fact that they were probably thinking the same thing. So, any closing thoughts on their debut album?
No, I can't really think of any. I totally concur with you about kind of learning some history through the band. A lot of references and just even the song titles alone. And
Right.
I especially appreciate their earliest albums because the subject matters are just so unique.
Yes.
Bands just don't write songs about the sort of things that they were covering. It's never been done before or since, as far as I know.
Yeah, and that's a glimpse, a lens into Andy's mind and Paul's in terms of their appreciation for World War One, World War Two, and all the themes that come with war. And still today, they're still talking about this stuff. They're great historians, and I really appreciate that. And I'm going to end our part of this conversation with another quote. And he says, "To me, it sounds like a glorified garage recording, but it has a naive charm, which I still really enjoy. There were songs we'd been writing since the age of 16 and distilled it down to what we wanted it to sound like. We were young, determined, and idealistic, and absolutely nobody was going to stop us. Let's move the needle groove over to our next album. This is their second studio album, known as Organization with an S. And this was released in October of 1980. Producer was Mike Howlett at the time. OMD also lent their prowess on there as well. And this album, it's pretty remarkable in the leap. You're starting to understand this band really coming together and deepening their identity. So, Chris, tell the listeners your thoughts on their second album.
The second album was actually the one that attracted me most. I loved the cover alone is spectacular. And I don't know, I really liked, of course, Enola Gay, which I find fascinating that I've learned that Paul didn't like it initially, or maybe still doesn't. I don't know. But I don't know. To me, you mentioned the leap. It feels deeper musically, but it still kind of has that sort of feel of the earliest album. But it just feels darker and more melancholy. For a long time, I would say that it was my favorite of all of their albums.
Wow.
I'm not so sure now. I kind of like all of them.
Yeah.
The first four pretty equally.
So with this album, I do enjoy it quite a bit. There are moments in this album that I feel do sound pretty dated.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in a terribly positive way. It's not horrible. But what I greatly admire about this album, kind of piggybacking off of what you said, it feels different, yet it feels very similar to the first album. It's bleaker, it's darker, it's heavier in terms of themes going on. But I feel like this is the album where they're starting to understand textures and layering. And I feel like that's where it kind of moved the needle forward a bit more for me, as it should, because they're progressing and evolving as a band. To me, this album sounds something that is very, gosh, how do I say this? It has this cold, dank, dreary England smell to it. And the album cover, it starts with that album cover. When you start an album out with Enola Gay, my goodness, it's pretty amazing. You have Electricity from the first one, and this one you have Enola Gay. They have these amazing pop juggernauts that to this day, when they play live, people still go bananas for. Just those opening notes that are so infectious. And I also feel like this is the album we're going to get a little bit more deeper with on the fourth album, Dazzle Ships. That'll be for another time. But I feel like we're going to get into that. A little bit. I don't know if sampling's it. That's the word. But just being more experiment. But yes, it's a great second album. And it's an album that holds up fairly well. Anything else you want to say?
Not a lot. I agree with you about it sounding more dated than some of the others. Solid Motion and Heart doesn't stand up for me as well as some of the others. But like second thought to me is right up there with almost from the first album. I just love that song.
Yep.
And of course, Stand Low, I find really, really fascinating on many levels. It's mysterious and cold and dark and interesting.
I cannot remember. I've seen them 3 or 4 times live, and for whatever reason, I can't remember if they have ever performed that live the times that I've seen them here in San Francisco. Stand Low is, to me, an opus. And there's a song later in their catalog, it's a B-side, that I also want to consider it's like a cousin to Stand Low. It just has that sentiment, that vibe. And what I love about Stand Low are the vocals and the ambience that is built around it. And I love that it has the McCluskey, his range, I feel like doesn't get talked about enough. And speaking of vocals, I don't know if you feel this way, Chris, but you're getting this feel with Andy's vocals from the second album. He's starting to push himself more. You can hear it. You can feel it. And he's starting to understand his strength. And you really get it on the next album. Can we talk about the third album? We're going to transition into the third album, which many OMD fans would consider their Blue Ribbon album. That's always up for debate. Of course, we're talking about Architecture and Morality, an album that, in my opinion, is pretty much flawless. For the listeners right now, I'm holding up the album cover in my hand. And on the back here, we get our 2 boys, Andy and Paul. But we also know that this album is not just Andy and Paul. We'll get into that in a sec. Chris, what are your thoughts on Architecture and Morality?
Definitely think it's one of their best, if not their best. One thing that I've always found interesting about it is to learn, having learned of the band through If You Leave, and then going back, learning that they were actually a hit pop band in the UK, and that they had several hits from all 3 of these albums, but especially this one, fascinates me because I find even the singles from this album to be kind of obscure, kind of strange. They seem experimental to me, and it's I don't know. I just think it's fascinating that to think of them as a pop band. I guess because they weren't popular at the time here in the US, that I think of them more as a post-punk experimental band. And this album to me is a perfect example of that, because yes, the songs are catchy and interesting and bright, but at the same time, there's a different layer there of experimentalism and just kind of unusual rhythms and intros, and I don't know. I think it's an amazing album, and it actually has grown on me over the years. I appreciate it more now than I did when I first heard it.
Thank you for sharing. So we have Paul Humphreys, Andrew McCluskey, Malcolm Holmes, also known as Mal, Martin Cooper, Michael Douglas. This album to me reeks of an amazing third album. And what I mean by that is, some people say the 3 is the magic number with bands. It's like they've kind of figured out their identity. They have a bit more money in their pocket. They understand how to craft songs. But what makes this album so compelling to me, and what I'm still drawn to, is you get the sense that not only do they appreciate history because it's riddled throughout this album, but you get a sense that they understand how to craft a 2, 3, 4 minute pop song. And they create the earworm. And they do it in such a unique way. For example, Joan of Arc, right? Made of Orleans. And then, of course, you have what I consider to be top 3 song of OMD's canon work. And of course, that's She's Leaving. And that song to me is the exemplar when it comes to synth pop perfection. I call it PPP, pure pop perfection. And that's one song, Chris. I could be in the snow doing cross country skiing and listening to it, and I'll repeat it. I could be on a walk near a lake and I'll repeat that song 3 or 4 times. I could be driving and I'll hit that repeat button. And my goodness, they have so many songs in their library, in my opinion, that I just want to reach for that repeat button. And let's not forget about how wonderfully sequenced these songs were.
Mm-hmm.
There's an amazing flow and energy that just pops. Go ahead, share more thoughts. Love to hear them.
I don't have much to add on that. I think one of my favorite songs has always been the opening track, The New Stone Age. I find myself singing the chorus to myself all the time when I make a mistake or I perceive that I've made a mistake. I know it's about more than just that, but it's always right there in my mind. That it's so catchy and so powerful at the same time, and to me it feels like an sort of even though they were techno pop sort of band, it's sort of an indie sort of sound to it. It's that guitar and the percussion is just very, you could just see, buskers doing that song. I mean, it has the eerie keyboard element to it, but if you took that away, you could just have 2 people busking in the tube singing that song, belting it out, and it would be just as good. And who puts 2 tracks on the same album back to back? That's Joan of Arc. I don't know what to say about that, but it's fascinating.
Let's go back to New Stone Age. This is the body I've been hoping for. These are the words I've been longing just to say. So this is my goal, the aim of my life. This is the feeling they warned me about. Oh my God. When he says that, sings that, that's another thing. Like I was saying earlier, he's starting to understand the muscle of his voice and the way to inflect and the way to emote. He's so good at that. It's hard to do. And when it's done well, it really can raise the level of excellence and the craft, the art, to just unthinkable heights. And you get a sense of that when you see him do this live. It's pretty extraordinary. I feel as though this album is one of those albums that will forever, I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say, will forever live, but never die. And we're so fortunate to have this in terms of a synth pop classic. Again, Peter Saville doing the art cover. And I'm glad you brought up, like, who puts Joan of Arc 5-6, and then in parentheses we have Maid of Orleans. And that big booming sound, that military sound is just, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It is. And they're both single.
Yeah. I'm going to read you a few things here about architecture and morality. Just some reviews. LA Weekly gives an A. Pitchfork, 8.7 out of 10. Sound Magazine, 5 out of 5 stars. Record Collector Magazine, 5 out of 5 stars. Is this their Sgt. Pepper? Is this their Pet Sounds? That's always up for the debate. Is it on that level in terms of the genre? Yes. I would say people that are into Kraftwerk, Gary Newman, very synth pop driven albums with some art experimentation. This is one of the few. This is an exemplar. Would you agree?
I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Speaking of live context, when they've done Architecture and Morality tour and done this whole album. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure someone's going to correct me in the comment box, when they came back in the mid 2000s, I think they came back with honoring of this album, and they played quite a few of these tracks, if I'm not mistaken. And hell, if you're going to come back, you better come back with a juggernaut like that. And they sounded so fresh. They sounded so alive, so energetic. And they're just, again, rejuvenating. That's another thing, Chris, about this band. They just have an endless warehouse of ace in their back pockets. And they know how to drop them and when to drop them. So in a live setting, when Andy's up there doing his windmill dance to some of these songs, and that's so great because you have the rest of them doing their own thing on the synth. And then you have Mal on the drums, who's just pounding away. He's like, to me, Pete DeFreitas of Echo and the Bunnymen. He can be very propulsive and just drive that engine, that backbeat sound. Excuse me. So what are your thoughts on their live performances?
Everything you said, I completely agree with. I saw them open for Depeche Mode in 1988, and I did not know what to expect. I kind of knew what to expect with Depeche Mode, that it would basically be a pre-recorded track of their music with live vocals. And I kind of thought it might be the same with OMD, but the energy that they brought and that they played everything live for that show was fantastic. It was very refreshing, very exciting. I did not know beforehand about Andy's windmill dancing, so that was fun. That was exciting to see. But yeah, they were really, really impressive and really fun and really good to see. I think they were the talk of the show afterwards. People weren't talking about Depeche Mode, even though they were the headliner. Everyone was talking about, wow, OMD they were excited.
Yes, their live shows take it up a notch. These songs explode out of those speakers, those monitors. And every time I've seen them live, the audience seems to admire their work more and more as time goes by. So, for example, I felt as though after each song, they weren't getting standing ovations, but the response seemed quite loud because I think people are very aware, like what you're seeing on stage, you'll never see again in terms of this style of music. And so I feel as though people know that's like there are these eras, these time markers for them in terms of their listening experience with OMD. And you go to these shows and wow, it's a very communal experience. And it's fun. It's entertaining. And they put their asses on the line and they really experiment with technology, but yet, Chris, they keep things so simple that make the experience so immense, so pleasurable. So you get a band that knows experimentation, art, avant-garde art, if you will, along with commercial sound. And we're going to get much deeper into that as we go through later in their years. Master craftsmen of welding all those together. Okay. Final thoughts on any of those three albums. Anything that you like to bring up before I have a question for you that has nothing to do with OMD.
I don't really have a lot of to add, except that when you invited me to be a part of this, I've been listening to the first four albums or three albums quite a bit, and I'm finding that I don't tire of them. I still feel the same excitement from them as I did when I first heard them, and I'm hearing new things. Maybe just because I'm older and have a different appreciation or a different level of understanding of the music, but I don't know. I'm still discovering them. It's like when I heard Electricity before that concert 7 or 8 years ago. I remember revisiting their back catalog the week following that show, just because I was like, wow, it's like brand new to me again. It's fun to be able to do that. I don't really necessarily have strong memories tied to them where it's like a time capsule that I'm going back to. It's still growing on me. It's still interesting and still innovative to me somehow.
You nailed that. I totally agree. It's still very interesting. It's still very fresh. There's a mystery around each corner. And I love that because we have been so fortunate to have them still perform, still create albums. We get this vast catalog of music, 14, 15 albums, and we're just scratching the surface. And so many people that have revered this band, and like most bands that have been around for a long time, you get to understand more about why they do the things that they do at such a heightened level. They're artists, they're great musicians. And I'm looking forward to more conversations about their subsequent work. We're going to wrap up this OMD conversation with a question I've been wanting to ask Chris that's non OMD related. Tell the listeners what are some albums you would recommend to them? Albums that you love that have nothing to do with OMD.
That's always a challenging question. I know that I feel it when I've listened to your interviews with previous artists. Everyone stumbles over it because We all have our favorites of the moment. We have our all-time favorites. We have maybe favorites that we don't necessarily want to talk about. A big one for me that I a record that always comes to mind is Abecedarian's. It's an independent project record label release. It came out in 1991, I think, 1990, of a bunch of the band's demos. They were an LA band. It's called The Other Side of the Fence. It's a double tenant release, and it's one of my favorite things I've ever heard. So if anyone can track that down, I highly recommend.
All right. Give us another one.
Of course, other ones, I have a lot of those kind of standard post-punk things. Like, I was a big Joy Division fan. New Order, I like all the early albums. Unknown Pleasures, Closer, of course. I mentioned Gary Newman earlier. The Pleasure Principle was the first album I ever bought. That'll always stand up to me. And I think it's a big reason why I like OMD. I like the sustained synth notes and that live bass that I mentioned.
Yep.
The most recent album that I've been really, really enjoying is Agent Blue, their third album called Stab. It's really enjoyable.
Okay.
I've been wanting to write a review about it, but I just can't put it into words.
You have a blog. Is that correct? You have a blog. Is that correct?
Yeah. I sporadically write and post things on a blog.
Would you like to tell the listeners what your blog is about?
It's mostly I just write some little write-ups about different albums that I'm enjoying. I don't write about all things that I'm enjoying, and I refuse to write negative reviews. And there's a lot of personal stuff on there too. I've had some medical issues, so I write about my medical journey, and just I don't know. I don't really promote it. So, but anytime I do post something about an album, you can be sure that I'm very excited about it, and it's a high recommendation.
So how can people find it?
It's on the blog spot. It's called This Wreckage, which is the Gary Newman song title.
Check it out. Check it out. Chris G., this has been a really nice debut conversation about a band that we greatly admire. And to all the listeners out there, this conversation is not about wowing you with all the minutia. I know there are probably books, podcasts, videocasts that go much deeper into this historical, phenomenal band. This is just about two people celebrating and honoring OMD as if we were in a coffee shop or at a bar having a nice drink. And hopefully you enjoyed this conversation and learned a little something that you didn't already know. And hopefully after this conversation, you will go and dig up some of their albums that you haven't listened to in a while. Go on to Spotify, whatever, however you listen to music. And with these particular three albums, you will kind of get a better understanding of why they are revered, not just by us, but from thousands of people. So, Chris, thank you so much. I look forward to our next conversation about this band, that highly influential band. And the next three albums that we would possibly explore would be Dazzle Ships, Junk Culture, and Crush. Not bad, huh?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our OMD tribute podcast. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and it has arrived, and it has been my pleasure to speak with Chris and diving deeper into orchestral maneuvers in the dark. My name is W, also known as William, host of the High Art on the Edge page, host of Surprise Cast. Remember, great music is all around us. You just have to keep your ears open. Ciao.